Lecture 22, The Intifada.
With stones in their hands, they defy the world and come to us like good tidings. They burst with anger and love, and they fall while we remain a herd of polar bears, a body armored against weather. Like clams, we sit in cafes. One hunts for a business venture, one for another billion and a fourth wife, and breasts polished by civilization. One stalks London for a lofty mansion. One traffics in arms. One seeks revenge in nightclubs. One plots for a throne, a private army, and a princedom. Ah, generation of betrayal, of surrogate and indecent men, generation of leftovers, we'll be swept away. Never mind the slow pace of history, by children bearing rocks. Now, this is a poem written by the Syrian poet Nizar Qabbani at the height of the Intifada, the Palestinian uprising against Israeli occupation that broke out in 1987. It portrays, of course, the paradigmatic symbol of the Intifada, an unarmed child throwing rocks at soldiers of the Israeli army of occupation. This is one view of the Intifada, a view of Palestinian elders being awakened from their slumbers by children. There's another view, however, that was brought out in a poem written by Hanan Ashrawi, a spokeswoman for the Palestinians, who is fairly well known to American television audiences. The poem is simply called Demonstration. The tire burns in an empty square. One child, pockets filled with carefully collected stones, stares at the army patrol. At his funeral we chanted, "Mother of the martyr, rejoice, all use are your children." Now, as Ashrawi surely knows, the last quote, "Mother of the martyr, rejoice, all use are your children," provides, of course, very little consolation for a mother who is grieving for her lost child. On the 8th of December, 1987, an Israeli military truck hit a carload of Palestinian laborers in the Gazan camp of Jabalia, killing 4 of them. 2 days earlier, an Israeli had been stabbed to death. It thus appeared to many Palestinians that the traffic accident was no accident at all, but rather an act of revenge. The Gaza Strip, then the West Bank, exploded in riots and demonstrations. This was the beginning of the Intifada, the Palestinian uprising. In the first year of the revolt alone, about 400 Palestinians died. Most of them were shot by Israeli soldiers. The death ratio during the Intifada remained at approximately 1 to 35. 1 Israeli died while 35 Palestinians died. Overall, the revolt lasted until 1993, the date of the signing of the Oslo Accord. Now, like other revolts, the Intifada, the origins of the Intifada, might be traced to immediate causes and long-term causes. To be sure, the traffic accident was the immediate spark that touched off the uprising. But to say that 5 years of civil insurrection was caused by traffic accidents is the same as saying World War I was caused by the murder of Crown Prince Franz Ferdinand. The Intifada actually came about as a result of long-term anger and frustration that was felt by Palestinians in the occupied territories. Anger at the Israelis, frustration at the inability to end the occupation, the inability of either people within society or the PLO to end the occupation. The first cause of this anger and frustration was the extraordinarily trying conditions under which Palestinians in the occupied territories had to live. There's a whole list of the complaints of Palestinians in the territories. The Palestinians deeply resented Israeli settlement policies and the expansion of settlements, which, as we described in a previous lecture, began to accelerate in the 1970s, the late 1970s. Agricultural production in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip was stagnant. Unemployment was extraordinarily high. In Gaza alone, unemployment reached 25% by 1990. By the way, in the first months of 2002, it has been approximately 40%. Palestinians had to put up with a maze of red tape and regulations that were imposed upon them by the occupation authorities. And it seemed that there was no reason for this red tape and for these regulations other than to remind Palestinians that they were the occupied at the mercy of the occupier. And this, of course, led to a great deal of frustration on the part of Palestinians. In addition to the trying circumstances that the Palestinians on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip had to live under, the regional and the international situation seemed to prove that the Israeli occupation was going to continue for a long time to come. The uprising broke out after 20 years of Israeli occupation with no endpoint in sight. The PLO, the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, was far away from the occupied territories in Tunis, Tunisia. And although the PLO was recognized by the Arab states, the PLO was still not recognized by either the Israelis or the Americans, two groups that would be instrumental in getting rid of the occupation. Furthermore, things seem to be getting worse in terms of diplomacy rather than better. On the one hand, in 1978, the Israelis and the Egyptians signed a peace treaty which seemed to ignore the Palestinian issue. There was a second treaty that was supposed to resolve the Palestinian question, but this treaty, of course, never got off the ground. There was a real shift that was taking place in Arab concerns in 1987 also. Remember, this was the time of the Iran-Iraq war. Arab countries met in summit in Amman in 1987 and decided that the most important issue now facing the Arab world was the issue of the Iran-Iraq war and trying to prevent an Iranian victory in that war. Now compare this, for example, to the summit that has taken place in 2002 in Beirut, at which pretty much the sole issue on the agenda is the Arab-Israeli dispute, the Palestinian-Israeli dispute. The final reason why a revolt like the Intifada could take place at this time has to do with demography, the way in which the occupied territories had developed over time. The Gaza Strip in particular, but also the West Bank, was an area which was not only poor and not only overcrowded, but there was also within this area now, in 1987, a generation of young urban militants. About 92% of the population of Gaza lived in urban areas. About 55% of the population of Gaza was under the age of 20. 80% of the population was under the age of 35. Figures in Gaza are roughly equivalent to what they were in the West Bank as well. So what we see is a explosion, a demographic explosion taking place within the occupied territories of urbanized, young, poor parts of the population that would become the main symbols of the Intifada. And of course, no wonder then that this symbol would be, the symbol of the Intifada would be a young man with a rock in his hand. Now, the Intifada was a popular revolt. All members of society participated in the Intifada. Many participated by choice. Others, of course, were compelled to participate by pressure within civil society. Palestinian youth confronted Israeli soldiers, oftentimes throwing rocks at Israeli soldiers, playing almost a game of hide and seek, a very deadly game of hide and seek with Israeli soldiers. And hence the symbol of the rock thrower that Kabani was talking about. The symbol, of course, was spread even further worldwide after the Yitzhak Rabin, who would go on to win the Nobel Peace Prize later, ordered soldiers to, quote, break the arms of the stone throwers. Older Palestinians also, of course, participated in the Intifada, mainly through something called passive mobilization. Most observed strikes that were ordered by a central leadership, which we'll get into in a little while. And there was a general movement to buy Palestinian. In other words, to boycott goods coming in from Israel and to attempt to establish a strong Palestinian economy based upon domestic production and domestic consumption. Now, neither the tactic of throwing stones nor the passive mobilization were tactics that were without a downside. Attempts to enforce strikes, for example, encouraged hooliganism, where people would take matters into their own hands. Young people would rough up shop owners who refused to obey strikes. And of course, there's a very, very fine line between, let's say, trying to get somebody to obey a strike for a national cause on the one hand, and extorting money or other things from shopkeepers for personal benefit on the other. The other aspect of it, of course, is that for the first time there was a mobilization of lower class youths during the Intifada. And since there was this mobilization of lower class youths, what you also saw during this period was a violence that often was a reflection of class resentments. The attempt to replace Israeli goods and services were also not successful at all. Israel still supplied water and electricity, and the Israelis had learned quite a bit about counterinsurgency over the years, and so were able to take countermeasures to break the strikes and break Palestinian unity. Now, it is important to note that armed confrontation between Palestinians and Israelis was not really an option. Weapons in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip were scarce, and there was the added bonus among Palestinians of worldwide sympathy that they gained by showing pictures of children brave enough to go out in the street and harass Israeli soldiers. Furthermore, since there was no real formal organization, an institutional organization on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, armed attacks against the Israelis would have been suicidal. Now, this is very different, of course, from what has been termed the Second Intifada, the Al-Aqsa Intifada, named after the mosque on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem that Ariel Sharon visited in September of 2000. His visit touched off a Second Intifada. During the Second Intifada, there has been armed confrontations on a regular basis between Israelis and Palestinians. After the Palestinian Authority had assumed control on the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, they were able to organize a police force, various intelligence units, various armed units as well, and they were able to acquire access to weaponry. But it is important to note that the Second Intifada, by the nature of the fact that there was a Palestinian Authority during the Second Intifada and not during the First Intifada, and that there was the use of armed resistance on the part of Palestinians in the Second Intifada and not in the First Intifada, demonstrates that the two actually are very similar in terms of foundations, but are very, very different in terms of tactics and strategy. Now, to keep the strikes going and to gain momentum during the First Intifada, new forms of association began to emerge alongside and sometimes in place of older forms of association. It actually strikes me as a bit ironic saying this, that, here I am, I'm referring to older forms of political association, and by that I mean the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or Fatah, or any of the other PLO groups that had emerged actually 20 years or so before the Intifada began. But in addition to Fatah and the PFLP, for example, there emerged in the occupied territories student organizations, professional organizations, neighborhood groups, Islamic welfare organizations, some of which morphed into, for example, Hamas or Jihad and various other Islamic groups as well. And these groups emerged to take a leadership role in the Intifada. Here, for example, is a description by a woman named Sirona, who participated in one of the women's committees about her activities. The Intifada didn't just happen instantaneously. It came into being because there was a movement building towards it, even though we did not know what it was. During school, I was only introduced to the work that students were able to do. Once I finished school, I entered into the women's committee. This gave me more of a bird's eye look at society and the social problems that society was facing. We took on several projects. One activity was making social visits, having in mind a topic to discuss with the woman of the household. Our society has been brought up in such a traditional way that women would accept oppression or repression in the household rather than even think or talk about liberating themselves as women. We would attempt to take these women into other areas to be introduced to many other people. One of the downfalls of a traditional household is that the woman is between four walls. So if she were able to go out and see women in other villages taking a role in society, this would give her some hope or new insight on what she could possibly become. The overall strategy of working with women involved two things. First, becoming involved in the social life of the woman, and second, through the involvement in that relationship, building a politically conscious woman. Women were facing real problems, and we felt if we wanted to be active and to gain the confidence of the masses, we needed to make these problems our problems. Those women who lived on the same street and were active in the women's movement would meet on a regular basis. But the following month, those women would meet with women in the next street. The goal was that these individuals see themselves as part of a movement of individuals who are related to each other, not to think that the whole movement was themselves. women's organizations, students' organizations, various other forms of organization that began to emerge, as Sirona puts it, as a result of the changes that were taking place within West Bank and Gaza society over the course of the Israeli occupation. As early as January 1988, these various associations, alongside Islamic groups, alongside various factions within the PLO, united into something called a unified national leadership. The unified national leadership issued communiques, which were distributed in leaflets and broadcast via Radio Baghdad and Radio Damascus. The unified national leadership supervised strikes, organized them, organized other forms of activities, demonstrations, and so on and so forth. Thus, it's interesting. The overall strategy of the Israelis had been to isolate the PLO. Instead of merely isolating the PLO, however, what had gone on over the course of the occupation was the emergence of a whole new group of associations that were organically linked to the people who were occupied, to the Palestinians in the territories. A self-developing group of associations that were almost impossible to uproot. Now, the unified leadership brought together all elements of the uprising. Youth movements were provided the shock troops for the Intifada. National committees coordinated activities on a regional basis, West Bank basis, Gaza basis, or West Bank and Gaza basis. And popular committees supervised local social welfare associations and enforced the strikes on a local basis. Now, this doesn't mean that the PLO did not come to play an important role in the Intifada. Indeed, the unified leadership signed its communiques, in the following way. They would sign them: the Palestinian Liberation Organization - Unified National Leadership of the Palestinian Uprising in the Occupied Territories. The participation of the PLO in the activities of the Intifada was, of course, inevitable. True, the PLO was based in Tunis at this time, and true, the PLO strategy represented the aspirations of not just the occupied territory, of the people of the occupied territories, but of diaspora Palestinians as well. And true, the PLO's ideology was secular nationalist at a time when Islamic movements were increasingly gaining adherence throughout the entire Middle East, from Iran to the occupied territories to South Lebanon. Nevertheless, the PLO had, since 1968, become an integral part of Palestinian nationalism. During the Intifada, for example, Arafat took on an iconic role. His picture was displayed in demonstrations in a similar way that, for example, other demonstrations would carry, demonstrations in other national movements would carry statues or posters of their particular national heroes or national forebears. PLO-associated groups participated during the Intifada, as I've said, the PFLP and various various of the factions within the PLO. But most importantly, probably, the PLO was necessary because the Intifada by itself could not end Israeli occupation. There were certain limits beyond which the Intifada could not move. The Palestinians needed somebody to carry out diplomacy, to negotiate with the Israelis, to negotiate with the Americans. And the PLO was already in place to take on that leadership role. Now, just a footnote, many of the things that I've said about the Intifada, if you think back on an earlier lecture, what you can see is that the Intifada was very, very similar to, in many ways, to the 1936-1939 Great Revolt. Both uprisings began spontaneously as a result of an immediate event. Both spread as a result of conditions that were increasingly perceived to be intolerable. In both uprisings, Palestinians built an alternative set of institutions. Both uprisings challenged the established leadership, but both uprisings, in the end, had to subsume themselves within a strategy, underneath the established leadership, in order to resolve the dispute or to attempt to move it to a higher level. So therefore, for example, the 1936-1939 Great Revolt ended up with the Arab Higher Committee in the London Conference. In the case of the Intifada, of course, it ended up with the PLO eventually moving towards Oslo. Now, although it failed in many ways, the Intifada was a milestone in the Arab-Israeli conflict. It once again put the Palestinian issue on the front burner of international politics. This was, as I said, during a time when quite a few other things were occurring. This is the late 80s, up to 1993, a period in which, for example, the Berlin Wall collapsed, was taken down, in which you had velvet revolutions in Eastern Europe, a period in which you have an extraordinarily bloody war between Iran and Iraq, which resulted in approximately 1 million casualties. But all of a sudden, once again, with the Intifada, the Palestine issue emerges at the forefront of the international agenda. The second reason why the Intifada was so important was the emergence of Islamic movements as an alternative to the PLO leadership. These movements would later challenge the PLO for the loyalty of the population. And frankly, now, during the second Intifada, when the Israelis tell Arafat, look, all you have to do is to keep your people in line, these are people who represent an alternative leadership to Arafat that he has to deal with either gingerly or has real inability to clamp down on as an outsider. The third reason why the Intifada was important was because there's a direct link, a direct path leading from the Intifada to the Oslo Accord. Many Israelis began to question whether it was worth their while to maintain themselves in the occupied territories that were becoming increasingly difficult to control. Israelis began to seek out a way to get rid of the occupied territories, which had become increasingly, their role had become increasingly a quagmire. And they also sought, Israelis also sought, a normalization of relations with the outside world, with, Europe, the rest of the Middle East, other countries as well. They sought a normalization that they could not achieve at the high point of the Intifada unless they worked out some sort of solution to the problem of the occupied territories. For their part, the PLO jumped into the opening provided by the Intifada, in part to assert its dominance of the Palestinian movement, as opposed to, for example, the Islamists that I referred to earlier. Finally, most hopefully and also most tragically, the Intifada pointed a way to an alternative Palestinian political order. This new order might have been built upon those associations, groupings, organizations that sprang up during the 1987 to 1993 period. Unfortunately, for Palestinian society, in my opinion, most of these associations have been taken apart by the Palestinian Authority, which, of course, became increasingly jealous of its own prerogatives in determining the course of Palestinian history.